Welcome everybody. It's great to see you all here. My name is Talat Yaqub. I have the privilege of, I say chairing a conversation, but chatting. That's why we've opted for not the lectern, just a little bit as if we're just all around the same coffee table having a chat. As I said, my name is Talat Yaqub. I'm a campaigner, research consultant, and avid reader of the Rainbow Trap, as you can see from the post-it notes inside. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to those who are online joining us too. I want to start off by a little bit of housekeeping. There are no fire alarms expected. If you do hear the fire alarm, you can follow the staff who will help you exit the building. I think there's information that has come up just behind me. We will be having a brief conversation for around 30-35 minutes, then coming out to yourselves for questions. And also those who are joining us online, please do send in your questions and the staff will be able to help us to answer those as well. The procedures and fire safety is behind me and it's outside the dome, leaving the building the way you came in. So let's get started. I have the pleasure of being on stage with Kevin Guyon. Kevin is a researcher, writer and activist. His research explores the intersection of data and identity with a particular focus on data practices that engage LGBTQ communities in the UK. Kevin is a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh, Director of the Gender and Sexuality Data Lab and a member of Young Academy of Scotland. And he is the author of Rainbow Trap, Queer Lives, Classifications and the Dangers of Inclusion. Thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us. Let's give you a round of applause. Now that I've done that awkward thing of talking about you to a piece of paper, even though you're right here, let's get started. I got a lot from the book. As I was saying, there's lots of post-it notes for me to go and talk to colleagues about things as well after this. And I think the more post-it notes I have, the better the book. That's the way that I have determined the acceptability of literature for me. But I want to start off by asking, for your own overview of the book, and in particular, what was the motivation for writing it?
Yes, so Rainbow Trap emerged, I guess, in anger, in frustration, which I think is a common thread in both of our work. Anger and frustration about some of the ideas or reception of my first book. So I wrote a book back in 2022 called Queer Data, How Do We Use Gender, Sex and Sexuality Data for Action. It was a bit of a 101 on how do we collect, analyse and use data, how do we design surveys, how do we run different types of analyses, particularly looking at data around LGBTQ communities. Between writing that book and writing Rainbow Trap, so about a 2-3 year period, I became a bit more disillusioned, a bit more sceptical, a bit more critical about whether or not data about LGBTQ communities is actually doing anything to help and advance the kind of objectives of making people's lives fairer, more equal, improving people's material conditions. I became a bit of a data skeptic, I think, between writing the two books. So I wanted Rainbow Trap to go deeper and more critical about what do we mean by data. So I'm kind of zooming out and thinking more broadly about categories, classifications, labels, not just kind of data when you think about stats or kind of surveys. I also wanted something that provided people a bit of a way to respond to this current political moment. So one of my arguments in Rainbow Trap is that we need to think about categories, classifications and labels to make sense of what's happening in today's political moment. Right. So the categories we use around gender, around sex, around sexuality, around race, disability, class, all of these identity characteristics have certain categories and classifications that come with them. So I hope the book would provide a bit of a roadmap for thinking through some of these ongoing political discussions, this use and misuse of data, how data about marginalised and minoritized groups is increasingly being used to harm us rather than to help us. And the book, I think, speaks to some of those discussions. I've also done something a bit strange with the book in terms of I don't go deep into any one particular area. I kind of take the reader on a tour of 6 different sectors or industries. So I look at kind of categories and classifications across things such as hate crime reporting, to the film and TV industry, to what's happening in health and fitness and in borders. So I hope that when you read the book, you'll kind of be taken on this journey and see how the rules we apply to categories of gender, sex and sexuality have resonance across these different spaces and places. And that you might pick up the book, being super interested in dating apps, and then read on and find out about the horrors of LGBTQ asylum at the border. So that was kind of the mission for the book and the objective, and something that bridges both kind of the research and the kind of scholarly work alongside the on-the-ground doing of this work. Yeah. So how do we take this book and actually do something with it? And I hope that that also kind of comes through in the final version.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're quite right on the feeling of almost like a tour through these issues, because I actually think it serves the purpose and the vision behind it very well, not to be deep diving into one of those, but showcasing just how prevalent it is across all policy, across all arenas and areas of our lives. And I did find myself, some of the Post-it notes say, yes, did this too, ! Which is just me reflecting on where actually my own work in kind of feminist analysis, in women's rights, anti-racism, has been caught in the trap. That trap of more data means more progress. Mm-hmm. And actually the importance of questioning that really comes across in this book and who it serves, I think. And I think you're quite right in what you just said there, you need to reflect on the politics of the day because it's not separate from the data that we're collecting. So I think very much in agreement with that. I want to touch upon your skepticism, one that I share. And it's the trap that really came, I'm going to say the word trap so often during this conversation that it's going to lose meaning by the time we get to 7:30. So, but the point of we want more data to improve our institutions and our systems, but the institutions and systems are not good enough yet to use that data competently. So we're stuck in this kind of chicken and egg situation. What are we looking for to get better first? And that they're not serving each other. And I really felt that. I felt that in the work that I do. And do you think that there is a solution to that? Because they seem to be feeding one another.
Yeah, and I'm really glad your kind of experiences, your kind of work experiences mirror this kind of frustration with this demand to collect more and more data. And I'm sure anybody in the audience or online who are kind of work or engaged in any type of diversity and inclusion work will have had similar demands for plugging the gaps, those missing people, those kind of data absences. How do we capture more and more data about kind of marginalised and minoritized groups? And I just became increasingly frustrated, particularly working in Scotland and the UK, where there is quite a lot of data following the Equality Act, following things like the public sector equality duty. We do collect quite a lot of data about identity characteristics. But charting what's happened over the past 10 years, thinking actually the on-the-ground reality for many people has not gotten better. Mm-hmm. Data has not solved these issues. Particularly my work on LGBTQ communities, if anything, has gotten worse in the past 10 years. We have more data than ever before about the experiences of trans staff and students in higher education, for example. But that doesn't mean the experience of day-to-day navigating a college or university has gotten any better. So I'm interested in this mismatch between the kind of the volume of data and also the quality of data versus how that actually leads to change. And it kind of, in the book, I'm kind of trying to be a bit more critical of this kind of faith and evidence as well. So this belief that if we just go out and collect more evidence about a problem, we might collect stats, testimonies, interview transcripts, we'll create a lovely report, a jazzy PDF, we'll take that down to Holyrood, to our MSPs, and we'll go, look at this evidence base, you have to do something about it. Right. I feel like for me, in my experience of doing some work around the Gender Recognition Reform Bill in Scotland a few years ago, where we collected a huge amount of information and evidence on the need to reform kind of the gender recognition process, to make it easier for people to change their sex marker. But actually, ultimately, that came to nothing. Ultimately, that amount of evidence, that kind of traditional approach to policymaking, all fell apart. It was torpedoed by a Section 35 order in the end. So again, this kind of lack of faith in these kind of conventional tools for evidence, for change, for doing politics, and the role of data in doing politics. And I think we're still stuck in a kind of approach to data that's maybe 10, 20 years out of date. We're not willing to see actually how we use data goes beyond just what we collect. It's actually about how do we communicate that data? How do we tell stories with that data?
Right.
How do we present data in a way that when it enters a kind of a media sphere, it's not going to lose its message, it's not going to become weaponized.
Right.
So that kind of use of data and that communication of data, I think is really, really important to help in kind of navigating this moment, but we don't talk enough about it. We talk a lot about how to design perfect survey questions, how to do better analysis, not so much about the life of that data once we let it go and kind of how it changes and kind of engage society. So yeah, those data conversations were also part of the frustration, I think, in writing the book.
When you said there that, you know, we do the data, we do the survey, we put together the evidence, here's the PDF report, we're going to go to Hollywood, described most of my career, so thank you for that. But absolutely, the conversations that I'm actually having with a lot of the third sector right now and civil society in Scotland and across the UK, in the current political space we're in, where data is weaponized, evidence is weaponized, actually, what story are we telling with the data rather than just the presentation of the data, the kind of overwhelming focus on the collection of the data rather than the strategy behind it and the purpose behind it? Because I think for some of us, it is, we've done this, we've evidenced it, we've proven that we're right, and then we're left in a kind of hope that this goes somewhere and does something better, when actually there's not necessarily, being very candid, the strategy alongside that hope.
Yeah, I think what you're saying there as well there's 2 points in that as well around, firstly, doing these type of data projects are extremely time intensive.
Right.
Labour of individuals, particularly in the third sector, in many kind of public sector bodies, it demands a lot of people to be doing a large survey, to be doing a large data collection exercise. But then that's just wasted energy if nothing comes of it.
Right.
And then when you were speaking, something else came to mind about we're kind of expecting a lot of people who receive this information, a lot of pre-existing data competence, data knowledge, to see a stat, see a survey, see a table, and to be able to make sense of it. And I think that expectation that when we release data out into the world, it'll be received in the way we want it to, is missing a lot. And I think there's a real need for more kind of that education around data, around how to receive, how to engage, how to make sense, how to be critical in terms of how we make sense of numbers, is a big part of that as well. So yeah, I was thinking of, all those data workers across the third sector, and actually it's a good use of their time to be doing another large-scale survey if it doesn't come to anything.
Yeah, and it comes back to the kind of equalities, competencies that we expect or want within, the civil service, that we want within MSPs or MPs, but we make an assumption that they are reading it in the way we intend it to be read, right? And I think that's where storytelling really, really comes into play. It's actually made me think about, it's not something that I potentially want dropping into my head, but it's made me think of Michael Gove. This is the point where I say, I'm an independent consultant and other opinions are available, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. But it has made me think about Michael Gove, and if you remember I think we've all had enough of experts in Brexit during the Brexit referendum. And it's made me think about that in particular, of we give more evidence in the hope that the expertise is respected. Yeah. And I just don't think that's the political environment we're in. Yeah,
and I think, I love that quote for the wrong reasons, but the sense of this kind of growing use of common sense as well. And I hate that word, the sense of we'll just adopt a common sense approach to data or to stats or to research. And it belittles the expertise and the experience of people who work in this field, and just thinking that we'll almost just go with the flow of the masses, even if it doesn't reflect the research, the work, the kind of underpinning rationale. So yeah, I think there's a lot in that quote that speaks to this moment. Yeah.
And interestingly, the masses are the loudest voices.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So absolutely agreed. So I think one of the things that I take from this, and you and I have had a conversation about before, is when the collection of data becomes the task in itself, and when data becomes a barrier to the solution. So you know, when you were chatting about, you know, do we need more data? And you said there about, you know, higher education, it made me think about the fact that, you know, if I think about the work that I've done on women in STEM, science, technology, and mathematics, and I think it's important that we relate this, how much this is related to women's rights and women's equality too. And there is no shortage of data. I could tell you in which university how many women are studying, you know, aeronautical engineering, right, in that university there, because we've collected the data. Can I tell you that their experience of that has improved? Can I tell you if data research and project delivery in that sector has improved to take account of women's needs and women's research and the delivery? Actually, no, that progress hasn't happened. But I can give you all the numbers you want in terms of telling you how many students, that is the X representation of women. So we've got that information. And I guess the question is that does data pose the barrier in itself? Because actually, it's almost a method of kind of kicking the solution into the long grass, waiting for the perfect data set.
Yeah. I mean, both this book and my first book, Queer Data, are very much of that view that we could go and create the best data set about LGBTQ people in Scotland that exist ever. It could be granular, it could be intersectional, it could be just imagine the perfect data set. But that has no reflection on people's reality of living in Scotland. And I think that mismatch between the two, what we said there as well also reminded me of the work of Sarah Ahmed, who's a kind of big inspiration for both this book and the previous book, particularly her work around diversity policies in higher education. And both of us having work experience in the kind of higher education sector, this kind of misuse of something like a diversity policy or a diversity data project, where it is just kicking the kind of underpinning structural issues further and further into the distance. So it's more easy to capture data about transphobia in higher education than it is to actually address transphobia in higher education. So again, this kind of stalling technique, I think we see that particularly in somewhere like Scotland in the UK, where there is a lot of data collected about identity characteristics. There is the question that people have sometimes asked me is, how do we know when we have enough? And I've been able to do some talks and some work in countries where there's no data on gender, on sexuality, where the state can basically go, you do not exist because you're not counted. And I think in those spaces and places, I can see a real argument for collecting some data to evidence people's existence. So for me, I'm interested, and if anybody has an answer to this, I'm kind of keen to hear during the Q&A, when do we hit that point where we have enough? When do we know we have reached almost data saturation and we can move from the kind of data collection phase to kind of crack on with doing the work? And I think in Scotland, I see a lot of hesitancy to that kind of cracking on, doing the work stage, and a lot of the let's just go out and collect more data, which is basically stalling the actual harder work to follow.
Collect more data, another working group.
Yeah, another working group, another steering committee.
Let's get a committee about how many committees. Yeah. I feel that deeply. So what I think is really, really interesting is the timing of the book. We are in a global pushback against diversity and inclusion, against progressive politics, against LGBTQ lives, against women's reproductive rights, against anti-racist delivery, affirmative action. I'm actually in my head now saying I need to stop the list. But progressive policymaking. And I wonder if at any time, has there been any critique of the book, almost in a, but we shouldn't critique the bits that we're doing. We shouldn't critique where the intention is good when we are under attack in by so many other spheres, in so many other arenas. Have you had any of that kind of almost just let it lie in the current political landscape?
Yeah, it's a really good point. When you were speaking, it came to mind that one of the first reviews from the book came out with the Morning Star, and I think in the first paragraph, the journalist had thought, when they received the book, it was actually going to be this kind of right-wing kind of polemic about DEI, and it does have the subtitle Dangers of Inclusion, which I think maybe spiked this idea that it's going to be this kind of Daily Mail style kind of rant about all that's wrong with DEI. Thankfully, after about 3 pages, they realised actually It was critiquing these ideas from the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And I think there is a space that we all need to craft for critiquing diversity and inclusion work. There's a lot of fantastic stuff, a lot of awful stuff as well. And I think you and I, both having worked in the kind of DEI space for quite a while, we've seen that in Scotland. And I think we should feel emboldened to kind of be able to call that out without feeling as if we are kind of fighting against the cause or being this kind of rogue voice that's going to make it all worse. Because actually I see it as a total opposite. Actually, I think by critiquing some DEI work, by critiquing some approaches to inclusion, some data projects that catch communities in a rainbow trap, actually it's going to make everything better. It's actually kind of self-improvement. We're actually kind of calling out the bad bits to make the overall approach more stronger. So it's definitely something I was mindful of. I think also in terms of the individuals working in those sectors and industries. So I've worked alongside kind of DEI practitioners, people working in that space for many, many years, many close friends and colleagues. I would never want to write something that's throwing them under the bus.
Right, yeah.
So I think it's a sense of how do we focus on these systemic, institutional approaches to doing DEI work while valuing that most people working in that space and place are good-intentioned, well-intentioned, wanting to do the right thing, and they're often very critical of the DEI initiatives that they're being tasked and asked to do as well. So again, kind of caveating that I'm really calling out these institutions and organisations rather than the DEI workers, and also I think for good intentions. So actually by calling out what's not working, by these tokenistic, performative aspects, we're going to make DEI better for everyone.
Yeah. And I think, you know, from what you've said there, more of these conversations are happening, but I feel like they're happening a little bit quietly and cautiously and in multiple silos, right? When in actual fact, when I was reading this, it connected so much to the work on anti-racism and race equality. It connected so much to the work on progressive women's rights. It, like so much on, you know, asylum seekers and migrants' rights, where data is weaponized or where we are being asked to capture more and more information. And actually we're at the point now where it's becoming extractive of people, right? Rather than making a positive difference to our lives. And I guess it's made me think a lot about, you know, multiple conversations I've had in different spheres and the responsibility on me, the responsibility on me to try and open up those conversations so it's less siloed. And I wonder if as a consequence of the book, do you feel like maybe some of these silos are opening up a little bit where people are saying, we're being critical, but we're trying to be problem solvers? Maybe we can have this conversation together.
Yeah, I mean, it's something which has definitely come to light in the past few weeks, having done some events and talks around the book, that increasingly I do see what I've written is a bit of a translation exchange exercise. I never wrote it with that in mind, but actually there is this kind of, I'm seeing how it is bringing together people working across different kind of equalities areas, but also there's quite a lot of scholarship from science and technology studies in the book. So some of the more academic sections engage ideas from science and technology studies around the construction of categories, the construction of classifications. I'm seeing actually how there's a real value in that conversation taking place among people working in gender studies, in on kind of diversity and inclusion work, in data science. This kind of translation, how lots of ideas in the book are not that new, not to kind of underplay kind of its timeliness. Some of these ideas have been around for quite a long time, decades actually. But what's missing is this kind of joining the dots. Actually, what can we learn by looking at what's happening in anti-racist work for people kind of thinking how do we respond to kind of the transphobia issue right now? What can we learn from taking some scholarly ideas from science and technology studies and making them accessible and applicable to how we design a data project doing diversity work? So some of the feedback I've had is that kind of translation piece. And actually, maybe that's what we're missing, because there is a lot of these siloed conversations taking place where we're doing interesting, innovative work, but not thinking, actually, how can we get more spaces for academics to speak with industry practitioners, for civil servants to be in the same room as people working in the third sector? I think that's maybe one of the keys to unlocking this kind of current political challenge.
Absolutely, and I think that, you know, the cross-equalities work and, in my view, intersectional work, desperately calling out for that. I think that is the response that this time needs of us actually appreciating how much more there is in common, and the shared fight for institutions and systems that don't put us into boxes, because that was the very opposite of the aim of the equalities movement in the first place. So I think there's so much potential in those kind of cross-issue conversations, because actually the system we're trying to change, we're all pointing at the same thing.
Yeah, and I think as well, it going back to something you mentioned earlier, the sense of there's a link here between the more data point as well. Yeah. So again, if we're creating more data, we're often having more boxes to put us into, more categories, more classifications, more granular versions of who you are. But what we lose with that are those solidarities, are those opportunities to see, actually, there's a lot I've in common with this person who is different from me. And I think the book's both critical of the more data issue, but also the more categories belief that if we just add more genders, more sexualities, more races to the drop-down list, it'll somehow solve the problem. But actually, I'm a bit concerned that that will just create more granular, kind of narrow boxes, and we might lose sight of actually those kind of broader collectivities.
Yeah, it's made me think about, it's a very neoliberal approach to equalities, when actually what we're trying to do is solidarity, when we're trying to, and actually the drop-down menu probably needs to be classism, racism, you know, what is it you're experiencing, as opposed to, and the system, as opposed to the emphasis on the individual. Right? I've got about like 10 more things that I want to now say. What I do want to touch upon is the political landscape in which we are having this conversation, and that you've just returned yesterday from the States. Quite a time to be there, given what has been happening over the last kind of 48, 72 hours. And in particular, I was taken when having this conversation, the way in which the storytelling and the lack of evidence base, and the storytelling with which how quickly some of the conversations around, you know, the perpetrator of the recent murder of Charlie Kirk, and how it was reported in mainstream media that it was linked to trans rights very quickly, and then that became evidence to be absolutely not the case, and that there was no evidence about it. And it reinforced this idea that, you know, it's not about the data, it's not about the evidence, it's about this, how well you can tell the story and how far you can get it. And I'm interested about your experience of having these conversations in the States right now.
Yeah, so you're right. I was very fortunate to get some funding to do some work in New York City and Cornell, which is in a small town in upstate New York. So both very much liberal bubbles. So it was a very lovely time to be in that space for a period. But to meet with kind of other researchers, other kind of practitioners and activists doing work on kind of LGBTQ topics, and hearing firsthand the struggles that we're aware of in terms of the kind of the Trump initiatives, the kind of executive orders, the decimation of the funding landscape for research on any topic related tangentially to gender, sexuality, or DEI.
On that, I actually just read recently that because they don't want anything on systemic inequalities, being because, of course, it's not the system's fault, that systemic was taken out of the funding, and that included systemic heart disease.
Yeah.
So
it's somebody's just done a Control F to find every kind of potential.
Absolutely.
But for me, I think on one hand, it reminded me that what's happening in the US is not a million miles away from what's happening in the UK and Scotland. I mean, obviously what's been happening in London this weekend.
Yes.
So this sense of US exceptionalism made very clear to me that we cannot be complacent. We cannot go, that's a Trump issue, that's a US issue, we're just going to focus on what's happening here. We have an election coming up in Scotland in a few months' time. Some of these issues will play out around all these discussions around the Holyrood elections as well. So for me, it reminded me of that need for us to have those kind of collective solidarities with colleagues, with kind of other campaigners and activists doing this work in the US. At the same time, it was really chilling to see how these initiatives have created a culture where particularly maybe younger people, early career researchers, practitioners, folk who are kind of finding their feet in terms of what they want to work on in life, understandably feel dissuaded from moving into a career doing work on LGBTQ communities, on gender equality, when they look at the kind of career landscape, the funding landscape, and go, actually, my life will be a lot easier if I just focus on housing on roads, on something which is uncontroversial or not as controversial. So that kind of chilling effect was really stark, particularly when meeting with PhD students, graduate students who are kind of just in that exploratory phase, thinking what do they want to do, and how this kind of climate, this culture, will create people who we will lose. Some amazing thinkers and doers who will take that other option for a variety of reasons. So that kind of chilling effect, I think, was really stark. While at the same time coming back and thinking, yeah, we can't just turn off that part of our kind of comprehension or that sense of what's happening just over the ocean, because it's happening here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this weekend in London is the perfect example of what is being demanded and who is being further minoritized, who is the attack line about. So no, I think that's very fair. But given you're just coming back yesterday from the States, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that actually people invited you over and wanted to have these conversations. There are people there are communities, there's groups, and yes, it might feel like a little liberal bubble, but are maintaining the conversations that matter.
Yeah. And they're continuing the fight. I mean, even if the environment's tougher for funding, for doing work in the space, they're not giving up. Like actually, the resilience is stronger than ever before. And I think that was also recharging to meet with other academics, other practitioners, policymakers who feel more emboldened than ever that they're doing the right thing. And I think that was also reassuring to see as well.
That's excellent. I think now would be a good time because we're just having a chat now. So I think it probably makes sense that we go to some questions from the audience. If I could ask the staff if they're okay to do that, great. I also know that there are people joining us online. I've been told there's a camera somewhere. I'm not sure I'm looking at it. But if you'd like to put your questions into the chat box, there's staff here who'll be able to help us out and ask those questions. But it would be great to get some audience participation, some questions from the audience if possible. We have one right here. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
You've talked a lot about sort of points which refer to things like data literacy and data storytelling, and the whole quote about we've had enough of experts. Do you think there's a further translation issue with the decision makers and the policy writers around maybe the risk frameworks or sort of thing like that could help bridge that gap?
Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Strangely, my first book was very much embraced by the data protection community of the world, which I knew very little about when writing it. But actually, that question about protection, about risk, about data harms, and I think for them, what they found enlightening was my book doesn't speak so much about the risks of anonymizing, de-anonymizing, disclosure. It's actually more about what are the risks of this data set existing in terms of the conversation it can facilitate, the misuse of it. So actually, something like the census in Scotland, where we now have this kind of national percentage for the LGBTQ community. So we know that 4% of the population, age 16 plus, are LGBT plus, and 0.4% are trans. And how those numbers can kind of help facilitate multiple sides of the argument. So those numbers can be both too big and too small. So I think that kind of weaponization of how the kind of storytelling around data, we weren't having that conversation. We're speaking a lot about data protection, about GDPR, about how data is stored and archived and moved around, but not so much about the kind of the harms, the real world harms that follow when a right-wing media takes a percentage and turns it into an entire media arc for that entire week's kind of coverage, which has a lot of devastation for those who are kind of identifying that way or see themselves in that way. So yeah, I'm very keen for that kind of lens of harm and protection to be zoomed out beyond the typical kind of staff training we get around data protection to think actually what are the broader harms of collecting this data. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Another question in the audience. I think somebody else had their hand up and I didn't catch it in time. Or online? Do we have a question online?
Yes, so we have a question online. When do you feel that a group can stop being described as underrepresented and have a realistic level of data and info about them, proportional to the numbers in society?
Oh, I do like that question.
Yeah.
We were having a conversation before the event on this kind of concept of numerical diversity. We're both very critical of this idea that because we have something like the census in Scotland that gives this population level count of most identity characteristics, now if not all, we can kind of say, that a group is under or overrepresented, but with a caveat that only tells one part of the broader story. So there's a chapter in the book looking at the film and TV industry, which for me is a really fascinating area of work to look at, because who you expect to be under and overrepresented doesn't necessarily map to kind of population level data. So look at examples from organizations like the BBC and Channel 4, and how actually for some communities who are normally marginalized or minoritized, particularly LGBTQ people, in some organizations they're not. So in the BBC, there's actually a numerical overrepresentation of LGBTQ people. However, when we kind of look at that top level acronym, it masks a lot, it hides a lot. So actually, it's not LGBTQ, it's just gay. And it's not men and women, it's just men. So actually, there's an overrepresentation of gay men working at the BBC. But that broader acronym is kind of suggests that the job's done.
Yeah.
This category are represented, if anything, overrepresented. We maybe need to be removing some staff from certain roles to get that number down. But we're seeing also, particularly, imagine in your work around gender equality, there are some sectors and industries where this kind of gender parity, gender equality has been achieved. Like, let's celebrate, the job is done. But actually, it hides a lot. It hides about that quality, about that qualitative experience. And I think, again, it goes back to the point, the numbers are only telling one side of the story.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily telling the full picture.
And I think in the same way, the acronym of Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, who are we talking about? Who is that? Who is underrepresented, overrepresented? And this idea that those experiences are the same. Extraordinary that's what we've done. And we were having a conversation before, and what it's made me think about is a lot of my work is on women's experiences and representation in politics. And we've had the Women 50-50 campaign, and it's about, and we had to pull out a number. We had to say 50% is the aim, because if we've got a target, maybe you will do something, right? But actually, it masks so much, because what we are seeing is a revolving door, where you might have a high number of women candidates, but they are much more likely to only do one term because they've had such a poor experience compared to their male counterparts, and they will then leave. The numbers tell you we're doing all right, but the experience of abuse, harassment, neglect, and being dismissed means that actually we have got fewer women staying, progressing, and succeeding in politics despite that. So big masking through numbers.
Yeah.
Do we have a question in the audience? Yes, thank you. There's just a microphone coming to you there. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I'd never heard of your book before, seeing, this event. So yeah, I'm gonna check it out after. You mentioned something about how data is so easily weaponized, which obviously data is data, right? It's like ingredients. You can use it to make something brilliant or something terrible. So then my question is, how can we make data that's more weaponized proof, that's harder to weaponize? Thank you.
Fantastic question. So I've got a few ideas just off the top of my head. And one of them is around, I guess, caveating the work that we do. So if anybody's in the rooms who's working with data, particularly quantitative data, particularly numbers, are often presumed to be this objective, ahistorical, apolitical artifact that's kind of just excavated from the ground. It's not something that's actually produced by the kind of societies and organizations we're involved in. So there is something about kind of, whenever we present data, particularly about identity, particularly about identity groups, kind of highlighting that it is imperfect. It is one representation of the world. It is not the representation. It is one way of seeing the world. There'll be lots of people missing. There'll be lots of people who are counted wrongly. There'll be lots of imperfections. So when I see something like, for example, data from the census, that's what I want to see. I want to see upfront in a little pop-out box, kind of a caveat, a disclaimer, saying almost all that could be wrong with this data set. It'll then make us be able to kind of better make sense of actually what's kind of listed below. So I think that sense of those caveats are one thing. I think there's a broader conversation, though, around some of the words we use when speaking about data. So in the past few months, I've kind of got a list almost of words which I just kind of cringe when I hear, and the list gets longer and longer. And some of those words are around things like data accuracy, data quality, lots of these assumptions, particularly data around gender and sexuality, that we can somehow, if only we design the most amazing data tools, we can somehow capture data about the lives of LGBTQ communities that is extremely accurate or high quality. And I think those words are actually very loaded, ideas about quality and accuracy, because there's a risk, and what we're seeing right now in Scotland particularly, is that it can be flipped on its head, where actually, if you then say your tools are accurate, but there's something still up with the count, then who becomes inaccurate is the person being counted. And we see this particularly with discussions around the counting of trans people and how this kind of flipping on its head, that actually the problem isn't with the data systems, the problem is with trans people. They're putting themselves in the wrong box, they are counting themselves incorrectly, they're just being a frustration to these data systems. So I think, again, if we can kind of be really mindful of words like data accuracy, data quality, and think how they can be, because they're presented as being objective or apolitical, they're actually masking a lot. And it's kind of accurate for whom, or quality for whom. So I think that's two suggestions, I think, to maybe help create, I can't remember the term you used, unweaponizable data.
I'm going to use privilege of the chair because that's made me think of something I want to ask. And then I'm going to come out to everybody, and I want at least 4 questions, so talk amongst yourselves and make that happen. But it's made me think about the fact that actually, near the end of the book, you talked about the fact that if you thought you were going to get a how-to guide, you'll be disappointed. That's not what this is, right? But you do still very generously give some ideas of what it could be. One, I'm curious about why you decided this isn't going to be a how-to guide. And I think I know the answer to that, but I think it's important for people who are reading it to also hear what that is. And second, some of the kind of next steps that you talk about is to start with the box breakers. And I think it's very important. It speaks to my work as well, but I think it'd be really helpful for you to tell us a little bit more about how you got to that as the starting point.
So I remember when writing the conclusion, and I thought, I have to have some list, some 5-point step. It's what everyone asks for when I do talks or kind of blog posts. They always want these 5 steps to designing the perfect sexual orientation question, or how do you design the perfect workforce diversity monitoring form. And usually when I do, it hasn't happened yet, usually when I do talks, there is one question where somebody asks, how do I design the perfect question when asking about sexuality? So try and get it from a different direction where it's more broad, more conceptual, more kind of questions to keep in mind when doing this work. One of my also tensions was there is no one-size-fits-all model to this approach. So there is no way of doing work on gender, sex, and sexuality data that works in all spaces, all times, all locations. Even within Scotland, my work advocates for asking different questions in different contexts. And as a good researcher, asking a question that fits the kind of phenomena you're investigating. So if you're investigating a question about gender or sex in a healthcare context, that might require a different type of question than doing a study on education or arts and culture. So this sense of we might have different questions for different contexts, different purposes, and that's not a problem. Actually, that might create better evidence, better results, and better insights. So that was my reason for not having a kind of 5-step approach at the end of the book. In terms of the box breakers, one of my suggestions going forward is whatever work we do around categories and classifications, start the project, start the thinking by those who fall between the categorical cracks. Right. So those individuals who will look at that drop-down list and go, none of them fit me, none of them apply to me. If we start with that imagined individual in mind, how do we then build our data systems, our initiatives, our institutions in ways that foreground those experiences, those who sit outside of those normative categories, and how by building systems with those box breakers in mind, it'll work for everyone. Right. So it won't just make the system better for those box breakers, it'll create a better system for everyone, because actually it'll have that nuance and that kind of context that has has those kind of caveats in mind. So yeah, one of my kind of rally cries in the end of the book is to build for the box breakers and to build these data systems with those who fall between the cracks up front.
And again, it makes me think about the work of Kimberly Crenshaw on the overlap, the intersection of racism and sexism. Her theory on intersectionality is all about overlapping systemic oppressions, what that means, how doing siloed work reinforces those. And actually, one of the things that she talks about is actually you have to start with the people at the overlaps, and in the same way. And one of the ways that I've always described it is rather than the lowest hanging fruit, the furthest away branch is, and it's just again and again, it's those. There's so many similarities across equalities work, and it's again a call for solidarity across the board. I think it makes a lot of sense. Questions from the audience, or if anything's, do you have something online? Sure.
Yes. So I've got a question from Cameron online. In terms of translating data into implementing change to improve population circumstances, who do you feel are the best people to support in doing this? For example, ensuring better data literacy in policymakers, data literacy in civil servants, researchers being more active in engaging with policymakers.
Very good question. I'm trying to think of a quick kind of pithy answer. I probably can't, so it'll be a bit more of a ramble. I think it's everyone's responsibility in some shape or form. I guess my concern, though, is making sure that responsibility doesn't fall upon the usual suspects. And by that, I mean people who are maybe already minoritized, marginalized for any reason, whether it's maybe early career researchers, maybe it's kind of your LGBTQ subcommittee. Often that work goes unpaid, it's not recognized, it's often devalued within institutions. So this task of then going out and increasing society's data literacy, which is a huge task, shouldn't fall upon them. So it is a kind of top-down kind of approach to this. I think there is maybe something, though, about the media climate, the media environment as well. So again, there's a lot of fantastic work taking place within universities, within organizations like the RSC, but what happens when it leaves that bubble, when it goes into the mainstream? How, as the example we were sharing earlier, are we in a climate and society where this totally fabricated information can spread like wildfire? How can we kind of navigate ways where there's almost something embedded in that data that it's going to kind of shut down? And again, maybe it goes back to the point about those kind of caveats and disclaimers that come with it, and just data skepticism is probably a good thing to have, being just skeptical about this stat, this figure, this graph that you see. So in terms of where that responsibility lies, I wouldn't be able to place one specific role or location, but yeah, making sure it doesn't kind of land on those who are already doing a lot in the kind of the fight to make society a better place, while also thinking again about particularly that communication, that use stage of data. And I think that's a lot of the political challenges we're facing right now. That's where something is going wrong.
And it makes me think about how much we do digital literacy, social media literacy, questioning what it is that you see, data literacy for young people in schools. And I'm often thinking perhaps it's a whole population bit of education that's needed. And I think we feel that quite deeply. Questions from the audience? Hi there, yes. There's one at the back as well.
Thank you. Related question. I'm very curious about some of the challenges of the story of the data and the way that perhaps you've seen some good examples of the experience of data. And from my own research, I'm very interested in the qualitative dimensions, like how that feels and how that can also be translated into effective communication to audiences.
Thank you. I love that question. I love what you said there about how data makes you feel as well. And both in terms of the kind of feeling aspect of maybe engaging in a data exercise. So not so much this book, but my first book looked a lot at the census in Scotland, which took place in 2022. And I was really interested in also that sense of how did it feel to tick the box gay, lesbian, trans for the first time in a national census. And we don't often speak about that kind of feeling aspect. But also for data workers, so those behind the scenes, those working for bodies like the government, National Records of Scotland, how did it feel to do data work, to be engaged in that space? So I'm very keen on that kind of feeling approach. In terms of how we tell stories, I definitely think there's a key role for that kind of qualitative dimension, for that kind of those testimonies, those interviews. But the challenge I find in my work, and I'm not sure if it's the same in your work, is I often feel caught in a trap where I know the most effective way to get senior leadership to do something, to change something, will be to give them a percentage, to give them a stat, to give them a number. But then by doing that, am I then making the job harder for those who are coming down the pipeline next? Because the expectation then is that they will provide a stat, a percentage, a number. So as much as I do work with qualitative data and come from a qualitative background, I'm often caught in this tension between how can I use my data to have the most impact versus how can I do what I know is right, which is actually bring in that qualitative data as well. So I think there's a real issue here about the expectations for how we navigate institutions, research funders, impact case studies for anybody doing kind of work in an academic space. How do we do that in ways where we're not just enshrining the value of numbers and quantitative data widely? So it's not something I can kind of provide a clear answer to, but very much can empathize with something I'm navigating in my own work, is how do I bring together and bridge the amazing insights from qualitative data and quantitative data without kind of putting numbers on this kind of pedestal.
Do you know, added into that question, you talked about a good example, potentially. Have you come across an example of the articulation of data and you thought, yeah, they've got that right, in the way that they've done it, in the way that they have perhaps created a compelling story around it, maybe got some of the nuance behind the numbers? Is there anything that you've looked at and you've said, do you know what, that's actually, I think, not perfect, because we've said that there is no such thing, but something that you think, actually, maybe they've got it right?
Yeah, so I will pick one example, which is quite high profile, and it is the work of National Records of Scotland and how they've presented data around sexual orientation and around trans status or history. So the census took place in 2022, and the numbers were published, I believe, last year. And actually, when reading how that data has been presented, it does have caveats, it does have nuance, it does highlight this question was voluntary, this question was asked only of those aged over 16. I'd have loved it if they had a box saying this took place in a very hostile environment, particularly for trans people at the time, and that might impact how the data, people's willingness to disclose that data. But there is something in not just kind of being really mindful of the limits of what you're saying. And I think there are some really good folk working for organizations like NRS who are kind of savvy to that, who see that how we share data about LGBTQ communities is different from how we share data on, I don't know, the number of trees along the road or some kind of more kind of objective example. So I think, yeah, there is some good work in Scotland at a very kind of high kind of national level that's mindful to some of those caveats. Yeah.
That's positive. I'm
yes,
glad that's
there's some positive there.
Yeah. Let me know if there's anything online, but I do think there was somebody who had their hand up. Yes.
Hi, thank you. It's been so interesting and I've really enjoyed everything that you've reflected on tonight. I was just curious, want to ask, what do you think universities could maybe do better around some of the themes you've been talking about, particularly given their student communities, industry and community partnerships? What could they do better with the data they already have and what they're managing? Just some ideas around that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So I guess one idea I would have would be embracing, spreading, disseminating ideas from areas like critical data studies, around kind of critical work on queer studies, critical race justice. There is existing scholarship and research that's been around for 5, 10, 15 years in this space. It's not yet mainstream, but I think particularly work around critical data studies could be a real way of posing these questions we've been speaking about. So whether it's among academic staff, professional services staff, students, this kind of quick 101 on what does it mean to kind of be that voice in the room who's kind of going, actually, I don't know if we need more data. Actually, numbers do lie all the time. They're telling one story. I'd love to find a way to embolden people to be that voice in the room, to be sitting in that committee, to be sitting in that classroom, to be able to feel empowered to challenge things which are often assumed to be this objective version of the world outside. And I think that could apply to whether you're working in something like maths or sociology. I think there's those assumptions that are there across the board in universities. So I'm very keen on kind of getting ways to get these ideas out there more broadly, to kind of empower and embolden people to just be that kind of contrarian, to be that voice, to go, do we need more data? Do we need more categories? And that could be one way of doing it within a university.
Oh, somebody's put their hand up. I had a question too, but I saw you first, so that's fine. No, I'm taking complete privilege of chair, and I'm going to end up making you stay here for another hour.
Fascinating talk, and I've only read the introduction of your book, but already I've got so many notes from it. I'm really intrigued by the structure of the book, though, and the fact that you've chosen 6 systems, institutions to look at. Is there potential for a second book where you look at other ones that come out? What made you choose these 6 in particular?
Oh, I like that.
That's only the introduction that's been read, and a demand for a second book.
Yeah, oh wow, thank you. High praise.
Good the introduction was.
High praise. I would love to sit here and say I had this plan of action. I sat down on day 1 and had these 6 clear systems set out. It was a hot mess of deliberation, of changing things around. I'll let you into a secret. There's one chapter in the book, the chapter on health and fitness, which was a very late addition to the book. So just before submitting, I kind of had this panicked realization I was 10,000 words under my word count about 5 or 6 weeks before submitting the draft, and thought, what am I going to do? Can I research and write a chapter within that time? It turned out to be one of my favorite chapters in the book. And in hindsight, I can't believe I almost wrote a book about LGBTQ communities and categories without a chapter on the body. And that chapter looks at health, fitness, the body, and I think the book is far richer for having that in there. In terms of how I selected the 6, it was a random mixture of some areas I've worked in or researched. So the film and TV industry is an area of my research in a previous job. I did a lot of academic work in that space. I work in a business school now, so the final chapter on the work and business very much reflects my current research. There are then some chapters that actually speak to lived experience. So I have a chapter in the book on hate crime that speaks to some of my own kind of navigation of those issues. A chapter on borders, which also gets a bit personal in terms of my interactions and experiences with Home Office and borders. So I wanted something that kind of spoke to both my academic interests, but also my own personal interests. In terms of a second book, my answer right now is probably a strong no, in terms of, I'm really glad with the outcome of the book, but it was quite challenging to write. I think that horizontal sweep seems really odd in an academic space. I've got colleagues who thought, what am I doing writing this book that just dips into these sectors and industries? At the same time, I felt I had to become an expert of many different spaces and places. I had to think, can this be enjoyed by somebody who's really interested in like behind the scenes of a dating app versus somebody who's really into how UK businesses design its accreditation schemes? So I think that broad sweep was quite challenging to research and write. You're right, though, there's tons of sectors and industries that I think could be in there that aren't. Lots of spaces and places. I mean, there's nothing in the book on education, higher education, which is a real interest of mine. A ton of other stuff that can maybe feature in Rainbow Trap version 2, but that won't be appearing for anytime soon. I'll be taking a break from writing for a while.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm aware that I think there was 1 or 2 other questions, but I think we've come to the end of our time, and with a perfect, potentially 2, not right now, maybe
distant,
number 2.
Distant horizon.
But thank you ever so much. I feel like I got a lot from the book, and I think an example of when a book does well is when it makes you reflect on your own practice. And it makes you think about how you can apply it in your own world. And I think that is a credit to the way in which it has been written. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience. And let's give a round of applause to Kevin, please. Thank you so much to everybody for your questions. Thank you for being with us in the room today. Thank you for those who are online and provided their questions too. Hopefully I got through some of them. There may have been more. My apologies. I have been told that there is a slide that will go up in relation to a book raffle. Yep. And so I will hand you over to the RSE staff, but a huge thank you for being here. And please remember that the books and these conversations that we have is also a call to action and solidarity for us as well in what it is that we do in the current political landscape. So thank you to you all, and thank you to Kevin.